Welcome to everyone to today's session of Gems from the Wisdom Traditions, where we're taking up the topic of a whole world view by looking at the founding vision behind the United Nations, whose anniversary we celebrate tomorrow. And we have the most excellent speaker to give us this talk. She is the longtime president of the Institute of World Culture in Santa Barbara, California. Carolyn grew up on the East Coast and took all of her education there. And so she tells us that she had access from the East Coast to the places that were so important in regard to the founding of the United Nations, namely New York City and Washington, D.C. Once she made her way to California, she became a professor, only recently actually retired, of philosophy, political science, and history. So she is from a long background. So, and I really should mention just about the heartfelt feelings that she has for the people of this world. And so by practice, by affinity, and by what she has really lent her life force energy towards, Carolyn Dorrance is a wonderful, wonderful representative to speak to us on a whole world view. Carolyn?
Well, thank you, Renee. And I can see that your association and program of GEMS is very universal because there is a kind of remarkable leap from the program last week in which we had someone of great skill and background teach us about the chants of a Hawaiian culture. And I totally enjoyed it and almost feel guilty of bringing us down to the world of politics. But I think you'll find that we're really talking about a vision, and I'm going to review also some remarkable people who grew to leadership posts in the United Nations and actually transformed it to an association far beyond the founding vision and so important for our consciousness and activity today. So, Robert, could you bring up the pictures? So here's the headquarters of the United Nations on the East River of New York City. It was fully opened by 1952, but although the charter for the United Nations was signed on October 24th, 1945, shortly after the end of the fighting in World War II. And I hope if you haven't been, that someday you have an opportunity to visit. It's very inspiring, and there's so much to it. It also has agencies in Switzerland that deal with cultural and social issues. It has a headquarters in Rome, which tends to issues of agriculture. It has a headquarters that's focused on economic matters, and I'm not remembering where it is. I think it's Paris. And of course, there's the International Court of Justice, which was actually founded in 1920, and that's headquartered in The Hague of the Netherlands. So, and it has offices all over the world. It's really grown in the scope of its activities. So do try to visit. You can find out boodles of information about its agencies and projects. You can watch its meetings and its annual kind of convention in September, where world leaders come and talk and elaborate on their vision. And you have the work of committees revealed. So there's really a great deal of information that you can access. That's the seal, the logo, and you can see it has the 7 continents within circles, and then the chief of peace surrounding it. Next slide. Well, now we're going to take a little more time to go through these. The United Nations is very much influenced by the history and organization of the United States. So they have a charter that was worked out over 2 months by representatives of the different states. The whole process from idea by FDR, he's not the first, took about 4 years to work out the U.S. position, get everybody organized. So this charter has a preamble, which I thought it was worth looking at to understand the vision. People were just unbelievably disturbed and suffering from World War II, 70 million people dead, and countless destruction of cities and more civilians who aren't counted. So they were really focused on stopping wars, preventing wars. So untold sorrow to mankind is what they had experienced. So they wanted to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women, of nations large and small. And certainly, if you go through their history and their policies, giving equality and participation to women was something they valued. And then wanting to bring more justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law, which had been violated a great deal in the previous 100 years. And then note number 4, because this is very, very important it wasn't seen as that important, but it's become very important, to promote social progress and better standards of life and larger freedom. Okay, so to do this, we want to practice tolerance, live together in peace with one another as good neighbors, unite our strength to maintain international peace and security, and to gain acceptance of principles and the institution of methods that armed force shall not be used save in the common interest, and to employ the machinery, and that means by technology and other methods, for the promotion of the economic and social advancement of all peoples. So again, now here we see the values that are in its founding vision. And then very importantly, so our respective governments, 51 of them, through representatives assembled in the city of San Francisco, and they had 2 meetings there, and it was like a great happening. People from all over the world came. Hollywood actors came around and strolled around in the hotel lobby to be seen. There was a lot of enthusiasm for this new institution. And so they want the governments to exhibit their full powers, found to be in good and due form. They've agreed to the present Charter of the United Nations and do hereby establish an international organization to be known as the United Nations. Therein follows, for several pages, 111 articles, somewhat organized like the U.S. Constitution, what are the different parts of this government, and then suggestions about peacekeeping, negotiations. It's a very rich, very easy to Google, and perhaps we'll get a sense of, as further on, of what exactly they value doing. This is one of the parts of the UN looking for economic and social cooperation, higher standards of living, full employment, social progress, economic progress, and development. And this has become, of course, very important as the number of nation states expands. And whereas they had 51 in the beginning, there's now 193 member states of the United Nations. And so they would all be members of the General Assembly and debate policy and benefit a great deal from the many agencies that have been set up, and to promote solutions of international economic, social, health related problems, and international culture and educational cooperation. And that all goes on primarily at their headquarters in Geneva. And take a personal example. If you decide you want to adopt a child from, say, Rwanda or Indonesia or wherever, you can get help in filling out the paperwork and putting that desire into operation, and so and gain the protection of the United Nations for that effort and for the protection of the child that you might be interested in adopting. Educational programs, it's a long list of things that they do, and always with universal respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms without distinction of race, sex, language, or religion. And they actually have other lists of characteristics that should be protected, not violated. And so all members pledge themselves to take joint and separate action in cooperation with the organization for the achievement of the purpose set forth. It is a voluntary organization. You don't have to join the United Nations, but if you do, you're expected to support its aims and its policy programs. Now, the other fundamental founding document is something called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And again, it is very easy to find several texts of this document online. It just will come up very quickly. It's referred as a milestone document in the history of human rights. And it was developed after the Charter, and the first meetings of the United Nations were January 10th of 1946. So this was a separate political process, and we'll explain that in a minute, but it was adopted after a year of intense debate on the 10th of December, 1948, and now it's referred to or observed as Human Rights Day. And so you can, so it's observed around the world a great deal. And this is seen as a common standard of achievement for all peoples and nations, the first fundamental human rights to be universally protected. It's been translated into over 500 languages. It's said to have inspired and paved the way for the adoption of more than 70 human rights treaties applied today on a permanent basis at both global and regional levels. Of course, it's a far more expansive statement of rights than the Bill of Rights adopted in this country's history in 1791. There are 30 articles, and they go for respecting equality, not subject to torture, equal before the law, things like that. Here's the dynamo who really pushed the Declaration of Human Rights, Eleanor Roosevelt, the president, of course, of President Roosevelt. She pushed this going over on the boat with the other members of the United States delegation, all of whom opposed it, said, oh, it's going to hang up the discussion and all that. But she kept on. She worked very well with the Soviet delegation. That's her giving a speech, which was just very well received. That's her looking at the newspaper report right after the declaration was approved. And that's her, notice in several of the pictures, like the signing, you see all men, but she got herself into the club, so to speak. So she was very much respected for her achievement. 3 leaders who arose. One was Dag Hammarskjöld, a Swedish man, who understood that the world was going global and the economics were going global, and he was an outsider and a compromise candidate that both the United States and the Soviet Union regarded as harmless. He was anything but harmless. He got right into peacekeeping. He helped expand the United Nations and its peacekeeping functions. He helped organize it to be more efficient. And unfortunately, he's known also for his book called Markings, which is his diary that's full of poetry. And if you can get a hold of that, you'll have a wonderful evening of inspiration. Unfortunately, he was killed in a plane crash on his way to the Congo There's many explanations from the CIA to whatever have been put forth, but there's no final agreement on who shot the plane down, along with 13 Irish volunteer soldiers. All peacekeeping forces for the UN are volunteers sent by a government. Here's a few quotes, which there's unfortunately maybe during of why he lived, and this is an important part of the vision, that a man should live a life of active social service in full harmony with himself as a member of the community spirit. An English poet, a friend of Hammarskjöld's, I think that got on to the next page, therefore, but he had this sense. He was a fourth generation social servant in Sweden. Yeah, we're not permitted to choose the frame of our destiny, but what we put into it is ours. He who wills adventure will experience it according to the measure of his courage. He who wills sacrifice will be sacrificed according to the measure of his purity of heart. He was just a wonderful man, quite private, traveled the world, set the example. He was the second Secretary General of the United Nations, and he really gave an example of a global leader with peaceful purposes. Also, this quote: in our age, the road to holiness necessarily passes through the world of action. And John F. Kennedy's quote is interesting. I realize now that in comparison to him, I am a small man. He was the greatest statesman of our century. I just mentioned President Dwight Eisenhower because at an important point, when 3 countries invaded Egypt and took over the Suez Canal, he was furious. They didn't consult the United States because they knew they'd get some pushback. And so he was furious, and he ordered them to withdraw and go back. This was France, England, and Israel. So that shows a commitment to the broader and newer purposes of the United Nations. This is a man, Kofi Annan. I found that many students have heard of him. He's from Ghana. Again, like Hammarskjöld, very well educated and inclined to understand the new technical resources coming on. He worked in many UN positions until in 1997, he was chosen because of U.S. forced out the man who was Secretary General. He was chosen, again, because he seemed harmless, and served 2 terms of the Secretary General, which ended in December 2006. He was involved in a lot of peacekeeping measures. He was very frustrated by the ineffectiveness of all the powers as well as the UN, and he was kind of a little bored. He was a very energetic man. And he said, well, something's missing to this United Nations. And he figured out that it had a bad reputation in the business community. So he decided to have breakfast with some business leaders. And that led to a much larger circle of collaboration, and even signing a compact of how the business community, and we're talking about corporate heads in Europe and India as well as the United States, would meet together and try to make more meaningful and effective the vision of the United Nations. And then he also noticed that this is 2000. He noticed that there were so many something called NGOs, on non-governmental organizations, and they had grown up. There's said to be over 3 million of them now. They had grown up and were busy doing things like Doctors Beyond Borders, like direct relief here in Goleta, you name it. There were just thousands upon thousands of volunteer organizations, with their own foundation mission statement. And he said, they are on the ground. They know what's happening. We should be working with them. And so he's the one that really pushed to expand you might say, the scope of loyalty and activity into these 2 areas of the NGOs and the business community. And that showed up in the millennial goals that you might have heard of, that they pursued for 15 years and achieved at least half of them. They wanted to reduce poverty, eliminate infant mortality, eliminate the vitality of the women giving birth, often in conditions which were horrible. And so you can look that up and see that was really an expansion of the vision and a more specific articulation. And then there was a real effort to check every year, how you doing on this, how you doing on that. And so you can call it a kind of soft power pressure on these organizations to help. I want to mention this woman you've probably never heard of,
No.
Mili Mayambo Nkuka. She's from South Africa. She early on, as a 20-year-old, was getting involved in trying to reduce poverty in South Africa and to help children. She became deputy president of South Africa for a time before that beneficent government got chased out by a not so beneficent one. She went on to found NGOs that helped women and children particularly, and she wanted to do it not just by helping them feed themselves, but to develop technological skills so that they could have the same opportunities as the more privileged. And finally, she was brought into the United Nations. She held many positions there. She became head of what's called UN Women. She served 2 terms, and she just finished that in August 19th of this year. And if I could just take 30 seconds, she made a statement, a speech on Monday, October 11th of this year, called the UN Statement for the International Day of the Girl Child. And she talks about how important it is to expand the digital skills and knowledge of girls and also of teachers. And so her parting observation is UN Women will continue to put girls at the heart of the digital revolution by supporting initiatives that include digital access and the development of digital skills, investment in feminist technology, innovation for social impact, new partnerships to build inclusive, transformative, and accountable innovation ecosystems. So she has been at the forefront of a huge expansion of women in the participation of both leadership positions and in the field activities for the United Nations. So over the 50 years, or now it's 70 years of its existence, its vision has been transformed, but also expanded to be right down on the ground in the communities around the world.
Wonderful. Thank you. I was wondering, Carolyn, since you do have a historic perspective that goes way back, is there anything like this that ever existed in history that we know of? Or what did they draw their inspiration from in terms of the past?
I think they drew their inspiration, and actually that is something that comes from this country. The organization of volunteer private organizations. I mean, that started way back when the colonies were just being founded, because they didn't have huge government systems and bureaucracies and budgets for, big projects. So the volunteer association in the community, and I brought in and gave skills to people how to help. And so I think that spread. England also was a place where that kind of organization was there. And of course, it's an alternative to saying the government should do everything. And that gradually, it showed up all through the 19th century in this country. The women's suffrage movement was an example. You want to get something done? Organize, mobilize, fundraise. So I think that that idea that people can get into the community and serve the women's suffrage leaders initially were doing things like helping poor women who were widows or something in the early 19th century. So I think that that's something that England and the United States can get some credit for. And they were the progressives of the late 19th century that said, okay, now we need to put this into legislation. Now we need to have government to support it. And then, of course, that led to the proposal after World War I for a League of Nations. And President Wilson had jumped on that. And that did get created. The US by then refused to join because you got this kickback of, that must be socialist or communist or something. So that failed, and it didn't prevent World War II. But you got, during the war and after, an amazing group of leaders who said, hey, we can do something, we can organize on the international scale. But it started by on the ground community organizations to help and serve others.
Wow, wonderful. I didn't realize that. Thank you.
Well, they didn't have Social Security and Medicare, and they didn't have
No.
backup for families that were impoverished. And I mean, they had their own morality thing, if the family drank, if the mother drank, then maybe that child is not going to get the help they need.
Maurice?
Yes, just to add, during the Revolution, Thomas Paine
Yes.
talked about the possibility of a League of Nations, where I think there's that phrase in the Bible about turning your weapons into plowshares.
Plowshares, yes.
And there's a wonderful sculpture at the United Nations that sort of reflects that.
Yeah.
So I have a question for Carolyn, if it's not too far out there, but well, I also wanted to have to mention, since I'm from UCLA, Bunch Hall, that Ralph Bunche could not vote in the United States, but he worked with Eleanor Roosevelt as a Black man.
Yeah.
And he did so much for Middle East peace.
Yeah.
And that really does have to be mentioned. But my question to Carolyn is, as you look now, what in the future or in the now future, the post-COVID future, or do you want to say something about how you or the United Nations might envision itself now?
Well, I think it's only been 2 decades. They're on a second round of Millennium Goals that has a different name, which expire in 2030. So it would help. You remember, for a while, the United States was so ticked off about something not that important that it refused to pay its dues. So that finally got settled, I think, during the Obama administration. So I think would help if the American public knew more about the United Nations and what it does. So I think working I would work within the agencies, which are now filled with many competent people, and so you're interested. Small businesses can get a lot of benefit from working with the agencies that help them do business in other countries or and sell their products or whatever. So I think there's enough organizational of a framework and commitment to spend some time making those work, and putting. It would be helpful if the United States took a very positive view towards it, and so they could regain some respect, which they had a lot of in the founding period, for the working with the United Nations, and then other smaller nations or even big nations like the Soviet Union would feel some imperative to support the United Nations and to let's encourage some of its citizens to get involved in the various projects. And of course, it would help if just to give more publicity. Right now, I think the word is don't talk about the United Nations. Just get in there and do it, because if you talk about it, then you're going to attract critics.
Cliff?
Carolyn, I was wondering, one of the tragedies of modern times is all the refugee crises around the world. Is there what work is being done through the United Nations to address
They're
all
right
the?
in there. They're right in there. They have organized and even expanded the organization. So when, let's say, Czechoslovakia or someplace gets a lot of refugees, or those coming over from the Africa in these small boats, UN representatives are down there right away trying to provide some elementary, tents and food, and they actually have an organized system of registering refugees and working to get them. They have to work with states and say, how about taking 200 refugees? So they already are involved. They have agencies and staff that are experienced in this, and they provide a barrier to violence by, say, Italy just doesn't want to just let them go float away. No, they'll make sure that they have an imperative protecting life, and they do help. They can't do all of it, but they do help substantially in providing some organized response to refugees. And countries know that, and so their governments are kind of grateful for that and respond. It's just that there's no permanent solution. They can't dictate to a country, okay, you should take 500,000 refugees, but they can give them protection and encourage and work with countries to take the refugees. I think we need a universal policy toward refugees that they could work with. We don't have that. But they are involved. They are definitely involved. They don't attract a lot of tension. They can bring in peacekeepers to kind of line up along a border. Like now in Belarus, there's this problem with Poland. And so Poland can expect, and in fact, I was just seeing in pictures of UN, you can't call them staff. They're usually volunteers. If they're military, or security, they're sent by a government. The UN will pay for that if they can, or the government may pay for it. But there is cooperation on that. It's just not part of a big policy solution that depends upon governments willing to accept refugees on a permanent basis. So I don't think they can be faulted. They're doing as much as their resources and the political environment allows.
It sounds like the next step, though, would be to have someone champion something about refugees the way that Eleanor Roosevelt championed that universal Declaration of Human Rights.
And of course, right now, like in this country, immigrants, including many of whom are refugees, have proved to be very good citizens, and they have skills, many of them, and we have a labor shortage. But people are portraying them as, if you're a refugee, it must be an immoral person with, bad goals and all the rest. And it's just stupidity to not have a more favorable recognition of refugees and what they can contribute.
Mm-hmm. David, did you want to add something here?
I often take things maybe to another place. This may be more general, but doesn't every conqueror, speaking about the historical perspective, when these ideas, doesn't every conqueror kind of have this in mind as their mission?
Every who? I didn't get
conqueror. I'm thinking
Conqueror.
Alexander the Great as an example, and for the Roman Empire.
He did organize cities, and he had policies, and he put people to work. Cyrus the Great did. He opened up the army to anybody. So it had a very diverse social impact. That people of different backgrounds are now in the same team, so to speak. So yeah, but it's not the same in recognizing their dignity, their rights, um, their equal citizenship, because historically you have very sharp class differentiations. But it is true that some conquerors know that they need to be inclusive in order to be successful. So your point
Yeah.
is well taken.
Yeah, like an earlier version,
Yeah.
or less evolved, potentially.
Yeah. And it was dependent on their authority. There was no outside organ. The UN is it's not, it doesn't have coercive power. It can be successful with political pressure, but a conqueror or an authoritarian they need the United Nations in some ways. So, and the current emphasis on helping women and girls, that's in the interest of every government and every society. If you have poor
Surely.
women with no man around, or they killed in the war or whatever, if you have children that are running around ignorant and etc., that's not in the interest of a government or a society. And people like Dr. Nkuka, she really made that point, and she now has large numbers of women who have been inspired and trained by her example. So they're spreading out and helping governments recognize that you have to do something with poor communities. She's constantly on the issue of poverty.
How inspiring.
Yeah.
I believe it was, I think what I read when visiting his palace, Akbar the Great was known as the Great because he had included Hinduism, Muslim, and Christianity. I think he had one of each wife, in fact. But the one that bore the male child, of course, was the favored. Yeah, so that a throwback. But it's interesting that the title "the Great" gets added to those conquerors or leaders who were inclusive. So I think this is like an early reflection of some dawning of awareness within the human population that inclusion is going to be necessary
I quite
for
agree
our
with
survival.
you. Yeah, I quite agree with you. In 50 years from now, maybe a broader spectrum of our population will just take the United Nations as for granted that we need it, and that we also just social policies that include people and empower people. I think, there are people in this country who understand that, but there's just so much pushback from those who would say you got to make it on your own. And
Well, from your lips to God's ears, then, huh?
yeah.
May it be so.
And one thing I think I tried to emphasize is um, the new push on working with poverty, working with refugees, very much includes up-to-date education and educational opportunity. And there are a number of people who you may meet who have a PhD, and they were born in a refugee camp in Thailand or something. So bit by bit, there is opportunity.
Hey, Carolyn, in
Yeah.
regards to refugees, I didn't even think of it during the Rohingya, when Myanmar was excluding the Rohingya.
Yeah.
What kind of role did the UN have? What was their stance on that problem?
Well, the first thing they did, but I really don't, I'm not up to date on the details. They worked with Bangladesh to set up livable conditions for the million refugees or so that were there. They didn't just let them sit in the ground and starve to death. And so there's actually a semblance of organized community life there, except when it rains. Um, and then they would try to work within Myanmar, but they put the pressure on them, as did many of the other countries, and they did threaten sanctions, but they didn't do anything about it. So when they show up, they try to bargain. Well, look, we'll provide health care. You can't just, otherwise you have diseases and they'll harm the whole society and things like that. So they usually start small if they have to provide some service which the government knows it needs. But the restrictions, on entry were very severe. So they seem to have, their pressure seemed to have worked to stop the destruction.
Well, as it is now, I was reading there's $8.5 billion budget a year that the United Nations High Council on Refugees has to treat the refugee problem. But the other big problem in the UN, of course, is the Security Council.
Yeah.
That really blocks us really being a United Nations. Do you see any way of dealing with that problem?
I think just persuasion, working persuasion and saying, this, you need to support this, not veto it. I don't see that a constitutional change, much as the General Assembly is dealing with it by trying to become much more active than it was on policy deliberation and voting on policy decisions. And so that's helped because, and then they can make recommendations to the Security Council. And if there's enough political unity, it does put a pressure at possibility of shaming the United States, the Soviet Union, or China. So I think it has to just be by the traditional methods at this point. Everyone talks about expanding the Security Council and doing away with the veto, but as long as some people have the veto, they're not going to agree to that. But it is a problem. It does limit their active support of creative decisions. I should note that because we think of peacekeeping, it's all about Israel and Palestine and maybe in the Congo and things like that. The last figure I read is that there are 105 peacekeeping forces, if you want to call them that, around the world. I thought there were about 10. So they might be small and they might be in places like Costa Rica, but they do their work quietly so as not to create disturbance. And countries like the big powers have to see that it's in their interest to have some of the goals of the United Nations achieved. And I think on the women and children issue, they're seeing that, but not on the what to do about the the strong arm groups in Iran or the Congo or wherever. And they did do a lot to finally, and they have done a lot in Africa. They're very active in Africa because there's such a vacuum of institutional organization.
So Carolyn, in terms of this idea of a whole world view, it is a matter of, this breadth of vision. And do you feel as if some of the leaders that you mentioned, such as Dag Hammarskjöld and Kofi Annan, and the woman from South Africa with a very difficult for me name, exemplify that? Is there someone else on the horizon? Do we need someone outside of the United Nations that can help bring it, or somebody within?
Well,
and maybe somebody else has an idea too, and I'm asking it of everyone, not just Carolyn.
Yeah. Well, that's what I've kind of gotten fascinated by this whole topic of global leaders, because I was feeling for about 4 years, where are the global leaders? There are people with vision. I don't know of any within the United Nations right now, and there's others that have already come and done their bit. Um, but those leaders are leading NGOs, and a week from now, I'll be more up to date on some recent ones. Um, so there are people who are committed to what I want to say is the new word that we should be using. Nationalism, although people are hanging on to it in some ways, it's really dead, because it was originally to refer to a nation of people, a group of people that was homogenous by language, religion, and all of that. The president of Hungary, or prime minister, I'm not sure which he um, is working with that. But I have heard, including from my own students, what we need to be looking at is humanity and human beings. And that's what the founding documents show. Our, our global vision should be of a world of that we refer to as humanity. Currently, 7.8 billion human souls are on living on Earth, and it's supposed to go up to 8 billion rather quickly. So that's a lot of people, but we need to think in those terms, and the human potential, the human need, and I think Americans need to get used to that word. So but I've heard it more spoken here and there. So, and I do think there are people close to the situation who realize that our task is our field of service is to humanity and to human beings, if you want to think of it individually. So I'm assuming, I can't mention, I could say that the heads of some of the CEOs are Doctors Beyond Borders, or um, this, I think it's just called Humanity, the one that's doing all the feeding of people in Lebanon and all that. Um, there are there are leaders, but their path is through the NGO. Um, and some countries will support them financially or with programs, but we've the Trump administration, I'm not supposed to say the name, pretty much eliminated our development uh, agency that was supposed to be helping. So I think I'll take it as a question and as a priority to learn more, which is what I want to do in the coming year. But I can't name specifically somebody right now. There are
Mhm.
people who want to help, put it that way.
Yeah.
And then some of them are corporate leaders. If they travel, if you see things, if you interact with people from around the world, you can change your. I know that's a lesson I learned when I took a kind of pilgrimage right after college. By the time I got to Egypt, I was saying, there's a big world, and what do we share, our human capacity. I could really feel that I had walked out of um, my culture, and that I was in a very big field of human potential.
How about others who are online with us? Who do you see as are some of our people with that whole world view?
Thank you, Carolyn, for your talk. One person that you mentioned that I have always been very impressed with, and I've given information about him to my students, is Doc Hammarskjöld. I encourage them all to read Markings. It's such an amazing book. And his life, he walked his talk, and he was great. But as far as current people, I think the Dalai Lama, even though he's kind of retired,
yes,
he's not really retired. He's doing amazing stuff. I think Vandana Shiva is also doing terrific things. There are people out there. Some people are more internationally known. But I think there are a lot of people on small scale doing amazing things. I think what Cliff and Renee are doing is amazing. And that's what we need. We need that kind of stuff all over the place. People willing to get out and walk their talk and help to make the world a better place. I don't know if we can. It's hard to get onto the international stage without buying your way there. And Dalai Lama is fortunate to have been able to do it, and Vandana Shiva has. But a lot of the people who I think have universal vision are not given an international forum because they haven't bought it.
And there's
so
no,
they stay small, but they get amazing work done.
that's true. Thank you for reminding me. I have the Dalai Lama and Vedanta Shiva on another list for the same topic, but since they weren't really connected to the UN, I didn't put them on the list. I thought it was important to emphasize these less known ones. So they certainly are good examples. And what you say, I think, is important. We're going to have to do this from the bottom up.
Yeah.
People start with just doing a simple job at direct relief, and then they kind of are inspired and make it their whole life, so to speak. And so we have to fill societies with exemplars of humanity.
Which you are yourself, Carolyn, in the Institute of World Culture. Let me call upon Lonnie Kwan. Lonnie is going to be doing a celebration of life for her best friend tomorrow because he was so devoted to the principles of the UN. And so I'm so glad that she was able to join us today. Lonnie?
Thank you. Thanks so much, Renee, and thank you, all of you. This was a wonderful talk to listen to and participate in. I was going to mention some of the young people in the world, like Greta Thunberg and Malala, and other activists for gun protection. Some of the youth in the world, even though they don't have the money to develop a world presence, they've actually managed to garner attention because of their youth and because of their passion for the different causes that they're working toward. And my ex-husband, best friend, and co-parent, who passed away in August at the age of 55, had a 30-year career in international education, study abroad with Eastern Michigan University, Lexia International, and also was at the dean's office at Scheidler College of Business for over a decade. And one of the things that was so inspiring to him and also to me is that there are so many people who are willing to step up. And maybe I still like to think that even if we're older, we're still not necessarily jaded, that we might have experience of frustrations and obstacles, but that it is still possible for an ordinary person or a person without lots and lots of money to organize at a grassroots level with other people. I'm also reminded of the work of Rob Fuller, who wrote Somebodies and Nobodies, an excellent book about not just classism, sexism, and racism, but it really is dignitarian. He talks about dignitarian movement, the fact that all human beings deserve dignity. And he's still speaking, I believe. He did a TED Talk a while back. He has 3 books that, if you're interested in reading, are very well done. And Robert Fuller is the last name. And then, just shout out to my ex-husband and best friend, Justin Mallgard, born in London, grew up in Mexico, Michigan, worked in California, worked in Colorado at the University of Colorado at Boulder, worked in Hawaii. I mean, truly a beautiful thing. I do feel like we're moving toward a more united world. I wish it were faster, and I wish more people were actively working for we thinking instead of me thinking. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Well, is there someone who would like to give a vote of thanks for Carolyn before I jump into it?
Well, it's a privilege to be able to have an opportunity to talk about this topic. So I'm the one that's grateful.
I think David would like to say something.
Yeah, beautiful presentation. Thank you so much for shining some light on these topics. I totally agree that it's an idea whose time has come, and I really appreciate that you're saying that we need to educate, particularly U.S. citizens, getting the word out. You mentioned changing the word from nationalism, so I thought, well, humanism, and it turns out that movement's been around a long time, and it pretty much has the same goal. So I posted that in the chat section. Might be something. There's foundational work done already from a philosophical standpoint, and thank you for bringing more awareness to us.
Well, Carolyn, that was a marvelous presentation. I want to thank you myself for giving us such a depth and breadth of perspective that you bring after so many years of being devoted to the welfare of humanity.